you, John. Please be seated, members. Martin going. I hope you're coming back, Martin. Well, I might do. Right. Right. Good morning again, members. Right, we'll start with apologies for absence. May I ask Debbie Barnes to report any apologies for absence? Debbie.
Thank you. We've received apologies from Councillor Mrs Brockway, Councillor Folkes, Councillor Kendrick, Councillor Parkin, Councillor Pole, and Councillor Mrs Talbot and Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Debbie. Are there any further apologies from the floor? No, thank you very much indeed. Item number 2, councillors' interest. Do councillors have any further interest they wish to declare that is not on their DPI list? Obviously, if you find something that comes up during the meeting, you can declare it then. Thank you. Item number 3, minutes of the meeting of the County Council held on the 14th of December 2018. That the minutes of the meeting of the County Council held on the 14th of December 2018 be approved as a correct record and signed by the Chairman. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Any against? Abstentions? There's probably 1 or 2. Okay, we'll take those as read. Item number 4, Chairman's announcements. Since the last meeting of the County Council, I've continued to carry out my civic engagements with pride. I thank the Vice Chairman and Lady, Councillor Tony Bridges and Trina Wright, for representing us at civic functions when we have not been able to attend. In particular, I was delighted to welcome politics students from the University of Lincoln when they undertook a model UN debate here in the Council chamber over 2 days this last month. It was heartening to see the enthusiasm from the students and political future politicians. On a sadder note, I have to report the death of former County Councillor Mrs Maura Morgan. Mrs Morgan represented the Mablethorpe electoral division from May 1997 until May 2001. Sadly, I also have to report the death of Malcolm Ashman, who was a Director of Social Services here at the County Council from 1986 to 1998. I also attended the funeral of serving Lincoln City Sheriff Roy South, who sadly died a few weeks ago, which was held yesterday at Lincoln Cathedral. A complete itinerary of civic engagements since the last meeting of this council are available from the civic officer on request. Moving swiftly on to questions, item number 5, to the Chairman, the Leader, Executive Councillors, Chairman of Committees and Subcommittees. I'm anxious to allow a good spread of questions across the chamber within the time allocated. I intend to allow 45 minutes for questions. I'm expecting councillors to be disciplined because of the time available. When invited to ask their questions, councillors should press the large button on their microphones to make it live and press it again to switch it off once they have finished speaking. I have a list of questions here, so I shall take them in order. So there's no need to press your button until you're asked to reply. My first question is from Councillor Tom Ashton to Councillor Richard Davis. Councillor Ashton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Councillor Davis, first of all, I'd like to thank you and your officers for assisting with securing a speed limit reduction in Carrington and New Bolingbroke, which has been confirmed recently on the 7 Mile Straight. This is a huge benefit to local people and it's proof that the system works. With that in mind, could I please invite you to come and have a look at the B11, 92 and A16 and see if we can't repeat this success on those roads, and also while we're at it, have a look at some of the other perennial issues in my division, please.
very pleased to come and visit you, and I'm pleased that we've been able to, in this instance, help you and your residents out.
Thank you. My next question is from Councillor Julie Kelly to, again, Richard Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Park Ward emissions has one of the highest car emissions in the city. The impact on respiratory disease, heart disease, and ultimately mental health are widely acknowledged. What do you think, Councillor Davis, should be done about it?
Well, you recall we recently walked the ward as part of your ward walk and discussed a number of options. I mean, fundamentally, a lot of pollution is caused by cars, and undeniably that's a function of planning and where we build houses as to where people want to go. The toss-up internally will become between, externally, sorry, will come between, do we build houses, do we encourage car growth, do we encourage pedestrian use, do we encourage sustainable transport? The reality is in somewhere like Lincolnshire, lots of people rely on their cars to travel about, so it's inappropriate to suggest we can ban cars completely. I think Park Ward needs some serious redevelopment. I get correspondence from a number of residents in the area who are concerned about rising levels of car pollution, but I think it extends beyond just the simple aspects of air quality. It's quality of life. You remember we stood on a street corner, didn't we, and there are cars. That sounded wrong. We were on a street corner. There were other people there. Okay, that now sounds worse. I'll keep moving. But it came down to congestion is an issue, but just quality of life issues in terms of, you know, the particular corner shop that we walk past, for example. You know, people are rat running, and I think the rat running is something that not only for Park Ward, but there are lots of places in the county there is something we need to do about it. But it will take a mind shift for people, because people have to expect to perhaps drive a little bit further so that they're not necessarily driving past people's houses all the time. But in terms of the Lincolnshire Connected work we're doing about a strategy for the whole county, one of the big areas is going to be how do we get people out of their cars, how do we get them on using bikes, public transport and walking more, and that inevitably will help. But I think we've got some meetings lined up in the near future to look at the more localised problems in Park Ward.
Thank you, Councillor Davis, and I think that's a classic example of how to dig your own pothole. Question number 3 comes from Councillor Adam Stokes for Nick Worth. Councillor Stokes.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The consultation on the future of the Heritage Service was launched at the beginning of February. Can Councillor Worth inform the Council of the initial response, please?
Thank you, Councillor Stokes. I think it's quite useful, if nothing else, just to give Richard Davis a chance to have a breather and stop him hanging around on street corners, probably. But just like to update the council where we are on heritage services. We've had up to date 226 consultation responses through, so that's quite encouraging. It'd probably take the opportunity just to clarify a few points on the consultation. The Usher Gallery is the one that seems to have grabbed people's attention. The aim of the Usher Gallery is very much around, the proposal is therefore to bring the registration service, put them in there along with a dedicated coroner's court. But it's important probably to note that through those people visiting those services, there will be retained public access for the art, and some of that art will be retained in there. I think more importantly to say though is that this is about investing in our art. It's very important to us, our art and culture, and this is very much about looking at the collection in particular, how we can make better use of the space in there, how we can have more flexible and more regular exhibitions, so it allows us to put in more art that currently people cannot see. If we take that as an example of the James Usher collection itself, sadly around about only 15% of his collection has been seen for many decades because of the environmental conditions and the security there that don't allow majority of that collection to be seen. There's no reason, for example, why some of those really wonderful watches can't be seen in the Magna Carta vault, for example. I think there's opportunities there. But I think this is an issue when we have big exhibitions coming to Lincoln, and we are intending still bringing in some major exhibitions to Lincoln on a regular basis, increasing the amount of art people can see through those rolling exhibitions, but by making the space more flexible, by using the basement in the collection in particular, which is a massive space in there, we can see far more than we can ever see at the moment. So it's very much about getting more people in to see some of the great art and culture that we have. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Worth. My next question comes from Councillor Kev Clark for, again, Councillor Nick Worth. Councillor Clark.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Nick. Could you give me a financial update on the development on South Park? Is it on target, or is it, you know, falling behind? And if it is falling behind, where's the extra money coming from?
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor Clark. Yeah, the project is on target. The original estimates that came out for that project, my understanding is that will meet those estimates going forward. So I'm not expecting any extra costs coming in there.
Thank you, Councillor Worth again. Councillor Clark, yeah, I think your mic's still on. Perfectly all right. I'll excuse you. Our next question comes from Councillor Mrs. Alison Austin, again for Councillor Colin. Oh, not again. A new question for Colin Davey. Councillor Mrs. Austin.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Councillor Davey. As we are all aware, Boston has a reputation for having a low-wage economy and a low-skilled workforce. This needs to be changed. Increasingly, the traditional industries of the area are becoming high-tech and require appropriately skilled employees. We want these jobs to go to local people. This means that training needs to be readily available for people of all ages in the Boston area to obtain the relevant skills and be motivated and feel able to aim for these jobs. What is the County Council doing to help bring this about? And I would like Councillor Davies' assurance that this will be a priority area for the Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Austin, for the question. Firstly, I'll answer the final bit at the beginning. Both for myself and Councillor Bradwell, skills and employment are an absolute high priority for this Council, not just today, but in the future. We're all aware of the challenges with filling vacancies in our companies and the shortfalls that we're going to have in terms of skilled labour in the future. So we have to keep working. I think the most important thing is to remind you, of course, is that the Council is only part of the employment and skills picture. The government currently commissions and spends about £50 million a year in Lincolnshire on that area. So employers and individuals also have to take responsibility for their own employment and upskilling in training. From our perspective in the Economic Development Department, we've supported over 800 people in the last year in Boston. So that's a substantial number to obtain qualifications, learn new skills, and by working with the local college, with under the training providers and the family learning program. So there's a lot of work going on. It's to help the low-skilled, the unemployed in some cases, but it is about targeting people into work. And a lot of those skills are needed in things like the building trades, as you know, in Boston. Substantial amount of work and not enough people. Also, I would say, you know, through the LEP, we've spent £13 million in Lincolnshire over the last few years on training programs, increasing the skill of the workforce. And also, of course, through the growth deal, we've got the new building in Boston, the new college, the EMAT, £9 million on new buildings across the county to support the skills training. So I think there's a lot of work going on, but I'll give you this assurance, Councillor Austin, you know, this is a high priority, and we'll have to keep working at this every single day throughout this council and future councils to make sure that Lincolnshire's workforce is the best it can be. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Councillor Paul Skinner to Councillor Mrs Patricia Bradwell, OBE. Paul.
Thank you, Chairman. Question for Councillor Bradwell. Could you please update the Chamber on the success of our full service, please?
Thank you for that, Councillor Skinner. Yes, I would like to just update members. We launched the Falls service the week before Christmas. We had met with EMAS, Lives and Community Health Service Fire and Rescue in November. We agreed to put £300,000 of winter pressures money into a Falls service because we know people who fall, elderly people who fall, end up in A&E, and they sometimes end up in A&E and don't need to be there, but they sometimes end up in a bed and don't need to be there. So actually we felt this was a good way to help the hospital and that front door of A&E. I'm really pleased to say we had a meeting last week, and actually we did respond for the month 30 days from December to January with 80 people, and that was just in the East Lindsey area. For a start, we had one ambulance who would respond in the East Lindsey area because that is the furthest distance for an ambulance to get to. We feel it's really working well. We're now going to have a second ambulance that will be situated at Market Raisin, and that will deal with the north of the county plus down to Lincoln. And actually the one that deals with East Lindsey is now at Boston, and it's dealing with East Lindsey and South Holland, bringing people in. EMAS are having to look at how they respond. They calls go in on a 999, and then they pick them out and send them off to Lives. And actually they've found that they're really busy anyway, as we know, so they're going to try and get a dedicated person to pull those Falls calls out. So I believe this is a really, really good thing that we should be doing for people, because actually, you know, they're settled, they're looked at by a qualified doctor, checked out, and when they say can remain at home, somebody then comes in to look after them. So I think it's a really, really good project, really excited about it, and hopefully at the end of the pilot, we'll look to see if we can continue to keep that going. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mrs Bradwell. My next question comes from Councillor Graham Cullen for Councillor Richard Davis. Councillor Cullen.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Transport. In our area, parents are always asking me when the kids getting up early to go to Grimsby College and only having one lesson or two lessons and have to wait around 5 hours to get back. Or the connecting bus from Lav does not turn up. They have to wait around, or they have to call the parents to come and fetch them. I have many issues on that, so what are you going to do about it?
Well, thank you for the question. And you're right to highlight this, actually, because it is a real problem in terms of, you know, clearly it would be unfeasible to run buses that meet individual students' requirements. And it is a concern of mine that as schools and colleges adjust the times of their school day, it's going to make it harder for us to run a service. I think in terms of the 16 to 18, there's a consultation out at the moment in terms of could we do things better. In terms of the individual issues in that area, it's probably best if we meet outside this meeting and perhaps have a look at them and see if there is anything we can do. But broadly speaking, we can't be responsive to the needs of individual students.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. My next question is from Councillor Matthew Bowles to Richard Davis. Councillor Bowles.
Thank you, Chairman. Quick thank you first to Councillor Davies and his officers. 2 meetings ago I raised an issue with grit bins being removed. I'm pleased to say I had a lot of happy residents when that grit bin was returned early in the new year. So a bit of a good news story. Foxby Lane in my division has long had an issue with speeding traffic. This is mainly due to the road being cut into two halves, one that has the national speed limit applied and one a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. As you can imagine, drivers heading out to the national speed limit speed up, going through the 30, and vice versa, coming back, don't slow down. Historically, you can see why this has been the case, as the 30-mile-an-hour section has housing, whereas the other section didn't. In recent years, this has changed, with 2 new large housing estates and the Mercury House Business Park being built on and having access to the road in the national speed limit section. When asking officers if we could look at changing the speed limit in this area, the answer we get and residents get back is that the speed limit can't be changed because there's not housing on both sides of the road. Bit of a bizarre answer when the section that's already got 30-mile-an-hour limit only has housing on one side of the road. Given that there's now plans for thousands of houses to be built on the opposite side of the road in the coming years, and an application for the initial phase of 400 houses has just been submitted, it would seem the ideal opportunity now to relook at this. So I'm asking if you could look into this specific issue and maybe have a bit of a site visit and discuss it on site if that's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pleased that we managed to return the grip bins. We have had some stolen this year as usual, which is frustrating, but it's important we get them back when they're needed. Very happy to come out. I mean, we've looked at the area before, but I appreciate with new housing coming, it's probably worth a relook, isn't it?
Thank you. My next question is from Councillor Mrs Marion Overton, MBE, for, again, Councillor Richard Davies.
Thank you very much indeed. We are keeping you busy today, and certainly it keeps our in-trays very full, the various complaints that we're getting. I attended the Transport Forum recently, and it was very good consultation, and I was really interested in one of the facts. It is that the traffic outside of Lincoln, outside of the cities, has risen by 42% on rural roads over 15 years, whereas in Lincoln, it's risen by 6%. So presumably, the cities were already congested, and outside is the one that's getting the increase in traffic. What I don't see is an increase in the amount of support that's given to the rural areas, and I was really shocked to find that we are expected to have to leave a dangerous pothole 4 centimetres deep in a highway for up to 90 days. 3 months for a dangerous pothole in a rural area. I'm hoping that you're going to agree with me that that surely can't be allowed. Thank you.
Well, in terms of the rise in car travel, it can't come as a surprise to anybody like me who lives in rural Lincolnshire that traffic's gone up. It's undeniably the case, and when you look at the growth in housing, it follows, surely. In terms of your language you use, it's not the case that we leave dangerous potholes. The point of the policy is to give us the time to present our limited resources in the most efficient way possible. And that doesn't mean driving around the county filling relatively minor problems when we have very significant dangerous issues that need to be addressed quickly. The fact of the matter is we don't have as much money as we want, and it would be grateful, I'd be personally grateful if you could get behind some of the fundraising activities we do with central government to say we need a fairer share of national funding. We know, everybody in this room knows how much extra, over £116 million we would get if we were funded in a similar way to urban authorities and to the metropolitan authorities. But notwithstanding that, we have to use our money efficiently. And one of the reasons with Durham, we're the first 2 highways authorities in the country to be awarded top rating by the government is because of our approach. And the fact of the matter is we spend money in the most efficient way possible. That doesn't mean we have as much money as I'd like to spend.
Thank you, councillors. My next question comes from Councillor Richard Buttroyd, again to Councillor Richard Davies. Councillor Buttroyd.
Thank you, Chairman. I recently met residents of Torksey Lock to discuss the 50-mile-an-hour speed limit on the A156. There's been a number of near misses along that road with elderly residents, and we now have a number of residents on there that have failing sight or even have guide dogs. And with the speed limit as it is, we're really looking for it to be reduced to 40 mile an hour to give these residents the time to cross the road before the traffic's on top of them. I'd really like the highways to relook at that, and if you'd like to come out, Richard, and have a look. I know we've discussed it in the past. I just feel with the way things are going in that area and the speed of the traffic, you know, we're going to have a fatal accident if we're not careful there, and I'd sooner address this before we get to that stage. Thank you.
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for this case, as Councillor Boutroyd says. We have stood at that section of the road and looked at it. I think I would remind colleagues that we have to have policies for the implementation of things in order that we treat the whole county fairly, and we have to follow a risk-based approach. The reality is that you can't put speed limits on roads solely to satisfy local concerns, because as a highways authority we have to balance the needs of the travelling public, which is why one of the policy parameters which follows national guidelines is looking at mean speed of the road, the cars that are already using it. That way you avoid inappropriate speed limits, but it's worth a look at. One thing I would say is I do find this frustrating, and it shows a mixed match we have with our local planning authorities, that developments are allowed to take place in areas that many people, both retrospectively and in advance of them, would have said it wasn't the best location. And you have to ask yourself whether putting vulnerable residents next to a busy road when they have to cross it was perhaps the wisest of moves in the first place. And of course that wasn't a decision that anybody in this room made.
Thank you. My next question is Councillor Rob Parker to Councillor Richard Davis. Councillor Parker.
Thank you. Morning, Richard. I want to refer to an email that you sent out yesterday. Abby Skinner sent it out, relating to traffic regulation orders, because it may be of interest to everybody, but particularly those in Lincoln. The argument is that in order to ensure TRO requests satisfy a community need, Lincolnshire County Council are only accepting public requests supported by county councillors, following discussions with the town or parish council. So the first question is, what about Lincoln? And I sent an email to Abby, but I thought now I've got the chance to ask you personally. What about Lincoln, which is not parish, so we don't have town and parish council? So is it therefore the new approach that we are requesting individuals to first contact their local or parish council with a TRO request? So in Lincoln's case, do we add that the first port of call for a TRO request from a local person is to go to the city council? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if the local council support the request, they can ask their local county councillor to request the TRO. So if the local county councillor is not keen on it for a whole variety of reasons, then does it fall at that particular stage? So I think there's some, should we say, amplification of what's here, so that we all know what happens in Lincoln, which is not parished, and what is the role of the county councillor to be able to confirm, but also stop any TRO request.
Thank you. A good question. And actually, this has come about from conversations we've had about some issues in your area around things taking place on the highway that you as a local member weren't comfortable with, and actually with lots of other members as well. You're absolutely right. In a mission, the area I represent isn't parished either. Really what we're saying is that the county councillor, for a lot of issues on the highway, should act as a gatekeeper. You have a local mandate, a democratic mandate on behalf of the people of your division to be the focal point for highways matters. So if somebody in your street, I mean, residents parking, I know is a big issue we've discussed at length, wants to talk about extending the residents parking, for example, I would expect the local member, be it you in Lincoln, or you know, David and Rob in Stamford, where this is going, or Adam in Grantham, where we're having similar discussions, would be the focal point for that. And in terms of the second point of your, sorry, to answer your first point of question, no, they don't need to go to the district council. Parishes tend to be quite a good place to have these discussions, but if they don't exist, then absolutely straight to the local member. In terms of, do things take place if the local member doesn't want them, then I think if I was, as a highways department, if we're going to say to you, as a local member in your ward, we're going to do something in your ward that you're vehemently against taking place, I think we need to have an extremely strong overriding argument as to why that's going to happen. It will happen from time to time, but by and large, I would like to think that we are pushed along and our ideas are developed very much in conjunction with the local member. So I don't see it as a case of either side of this argument stopping things happen. That said, if you were to come to me and say, you know, some residents have approached me, they want the extension of the residents parking, and you say no, I would be able to push to suggest why it should take place when the local member is so much against it.
Thank you. My next question is Councillor Mrs. Angela Newton for, guess who? Councillor Richard Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Davis, firstly, many thanks for attending a meeting in Spalding on Wednesday evening. Much appreciated. After seeing firsthand how residents are affected when they're not properly advised of a major development affecting their homes, i.e. the possibility they're likely to be subject to a compulsory order, would you please give us an assurance that you will instruct officers to ensure a better procedure will be effected forthwith, so that residents each receive an individual letter advising them of proposals? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely, the instruction's already been done, and I think for members' knowledge, we're as part of the local plan in South Holland area, we're looking to build a Spalding Western Relief Road, and there has been an issue around the potential of the route requiring CPOing or buying of some people's properties, and to be fair, we failed. We dropped the ball. We didn't contact those members of the public individually, and Councillor Newton and Councillor Sneath organised a public meeting on Wednesday night, and it was a tough meeting, and rightly so. I think if I found out through, second hand that somebody was looking to demolish my house to build a road, I'd be pretty pissed off. So I don't blame anybody at all. I have to say, as local members, I think they did an excellent job of getting people together, and it was a good discussion. I spoke to a number of people who are directly concerned, and we will be contacting them personally to run through some options. No decisions have been made. It's a long way off, but that was still no excuse. But I would like to thank Angela Newton for the gift of some cake this morning, which, if any members want to know, it is the going currency for my attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Nice to see you using technical terms. My next question is from Councillor Alexander Morn for Councillor Mrs Tricia Bradwell, OBE. Councillor Morn.
Thank you, Chairman. In January, the publication of the 2018 Key Stage 2, Key Stage 4 results identified a number of Lincolnshire schools which did not achieve as high as we would hope. Could Councillor Bradwell please update the Council on LCC's conversations with these schools? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Morn, for that. Actually, as Councillor Davies said, skills education have always been something that we've really prioritised in this council, and actually it does worry us somewhat when we schools aren't doing what they should be. We did have 8 primaries and 9 secondaries who didn't achieve the expected level of performance, and we are supporting schools, but as councillors will know, we no longer invest millions of pounds in school improvement. The government decided in 2010 they didn't want us to do that. But actually we do have a board of teachers, our Lincolnshire Learning Board, who have with us been bidding for national school improvement money. And we have actually drawn down 1.2 million, which we've been using in primary schools to improve English and maths. And there's a whole raft of school improvement targeting that we do with schools. But I think the English and the maths that we've been doing in a lot of our schools has shown some improvement over the last year. We are also working with North Yorkshire, who are delivering a professional development programme for our teachers in our really small schools. We've got 100 schools with less than 100 children in them, so classes with 30 and 40 children. As many people will know, it's probably the head teacher and just one other teacher in Key Stage 1. So very difficult to plan and to have some interaction on planning lessons. So we're doing a lot with 40 of our smallest schools. As I've mentioned, the Lincolnshire Learning Partnership are implementing a programme called Mobilise, which is aimed at bringing research into life in the classroom. And that's now working with 300 schools, and it's about transforming the use of TAs in the classroom in this age. Also working with Senkos, because again Senkos are very, very important in our schools, and their skills and expertise. So we are doing a lot of work, and obviously we're still going to be doing that in this year, next year and whenever, but it is a cause for concern. And obviously in our secondary schools we've had Progress 8 was the examinations this year, obviously the first year, and so we need to see what happens this year. But we're not sitting back and taking this lightly. We are doing all we can to help our schools that have struggled over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mr Bradwell. My next question is from Councillor Paul Key to Councillor Richard Davis. Councillor Key.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Richard, I ain't got no cane neither. Question is about street lights. If parishes take on all the street lights at £300 or £150 a go, how much money does LCC make? And is that it for street lights charging? Thank you.
We don't make anything on that. That's the cost of doing the street lights. And in terms of forward charging, don't anticipate charging anything else. It's about parishes taking on and spending the money locally where they feel it's appropriate for their residents.
Thank you. A nice brief reply. My next question, Councillor Steve Kirk, again for Councillor Richard Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Last year I had the pleasure of taking part in a consultation on a project called the Coastal Highway. Early indications are that this year we're going to have a bumper season on our glorious piece of Lincolnshire coast. I was just wondering if the Council was able to give us an update on where we are with the Coastal Highway, because I think it could be needed sooner rather than later.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to hear that you're expecting a nice busy season on the coast. In terms of particular projects that have really come out of the assessment, we're looking at the North Highcombe Relief Road, Rugby Road Crossing, work in Skegness, and also, of course, the big project, and certainly the bottleneck, which is the Horncastle Bypass. I have to say, just to set a level of expectation, I don't see any of those roads being completed before the summer this year, unfortunately. However, we are undertaking work with people like Midlands Connect and the Department for Transport to see about how we can fund them.
Thank you. My next question is Councillor Robin Renshaw for, guess who? Richard Davis.
Well, that's not quite true, Chairman, because it's also got connotations for the Director of Public Health and the Director of Children's Services. It is on. Yeah, some argument light under a bushel. No. I won't get into debate like that, but when the leader always notices me, I feel very privileged. Right, the UK has the highest levels of asthma deaths among young people in Europe. Our consultation on the Lincoln Transport Strategy already shows that air quality is an area of widespread concern. Can the portfolio holder for highways, in conjunction with the colleagues from DPH and DCS, initiate an immediate review because children are being daily exposed to illegal doses of poisonous fumes which affect their long and immediate term health? I mean, Richard said just now, it's all, with a similar issue in Parkwood, it's all down to cars with the freedom to pollute us all, and that's not good enough. We need to show leadership in spite of it not being politically popular. The risks to future generations are quite clear. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a timely question, and it's worthy of note. You know, as members here will appreciate, I would hate to steal the thunder from our friends in district councils. You may be aware that they are responsible for producing air quality action plans directly to DEFRA in response to these issues. And for example, we set up some time ago a local transport board in Boston. This is very much on the agenda for the board, and we've supported the district council there in addressing or seeking to address some of the issues around air quality, because of course, while cars are significant, it's where their cars are going to and from that's really driving that. That is a process we're rolling out into Lincoln and all the major towns in Lincolnshire, and I think air quality will be one of those issues that will be high up the agenda for the boards to look at. The reality is it is a complicated issue and it won't be fixed overnight. But it's about getting people out of their cars. However, we can often say people want to use sustainable transport, but you only have to look at bus usage in many areas, even in urban areas like Lincoln, in your particular patch in the north, Robin. You know, lots of people are still choosing to drive in for a variety of social reasons, and we've got the kind of pay-and-gain mechanism in place. In terms of broader projects, things like the Lincoln Eastern Bypass are entirely designed to move vehicles, particularly HGVs, which produce far more particulates than standard motor cars, out of the city. Now, that's That's not a complete solution, but it does mean if you're walking in and out or cycling in and out, there'll be a lot less traffic in Lincoln once that's open. And further projects like the North Icombe Relief Road seek to do the same there. And likewise in Grantham with the Southern Relief Road, that's one of the key drivers for that project. So I think we are taking this very seriously and working hard to support colleagues in their delivery.
Thank you, councillors. Our final question is from Councillor Ian Fleetwood to Councillor Davies. Councillor Fleetwood.
I was just beginning to wonder if there would be time for me to ask this question. Well, it's actually a double whammy. So it's all about infrastructure as well. First of all, a lot of people might or might not be aware that Bardney Bridge is due to close for a period of several weeks in the, from the middle of April forwards. And this is causing a lot of debate, discussion locally with regard to how agriculture can function, how the bus services might operate, and indeed how people might commute to work. It's made doubly worse by potentially other roadworks being made in the area. Although they shouldn't coincide, I'd like reassurance that the Lincoln Eastern Bypass roundabout also will not be closing at the same time on the Fiskerton Road. And just moving on to the issue of the Lincoln Eastern Bypass, as we're aware, the contractors recently have gone into receivership with regard to earth movements. Can the portfolio holder reassure me that the bypass will be delivered on time and potentially within budget?
Thank you. You're right. Bardney Bridge is due to close, I think, from about the 15th of April for about 3 months. It's a big piece of infrastructure. I'm sure many colleagues have driven over it. No, it's a big bridge, key link, particularly in your area, Ian, but for the wider economy. Really one of the drivers, obviously the work needs to be done, but we're trying to get it done before the harvest season starts, because in that area, particularly considering the location, it would be a disaster if it was closed then. And I'm sure nobody in this room needs me to remind people of the importance of maintaining bridges. In terms of Lincoln Eastern Bypass, yes, Hawks, one of the primary earth-moving contractors, did go into receivership. Another painful turn on the delivery of this road, as many I'm sure will agree. The reality is I'm very pleased that Galliford Try have managed to step in. They've taken over a lot of the works directly, and the groundworks continues to be taking place. At this stage, I'm not expecting undue alterations to the timeline or to the costs, but obviously that is subject to change. The reality is businesses do go in and out of success and fail at times, and these things do happen. It's part and parcel of building such a complicated, large piece of infrastructure that, as I'm sure Ian and others know, does require a significant amount of earth moving. I'm pleased to say infrastructure like the bridges went in and the temporary road haul has gone in. And if members haven't had a chance to come and have a look at it, please get in touch with me, because it's quite staggering the amount of work that's been done already on this much needed piece of infrastructure.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Well, we've done pretty well today. We've had a good mix of questions, and we've had some very comprehensive answers. Right, moving on to item number 6, the highlight of our day, the council budget. I plan to deal with this item as outlined in the order of proceedings on page 3 and 4. I propose that we temporarily amend council procedure rules and have one debate. I'm to move that Councillor M.J. Hill, OBE, Leader of the Council, in introducing and moving the budget and in responding to issues raised during the debate, be allowed to speak without limit of time at points A and F on the order of proceedings. That proposers of any amendments listed in the order of proceedings each be allowed to speak without limit of time at point C on the order of proceedings. That councillors seconding the motions each be allowed to speak for 6 minutes at points B and D on the order of proceedings. That other speakers each be allowed to speak for 3 minutes at points E on the order of proceedings, and that no further substantial amendments be moved. Could I have a seconder to that proposal? Tony? Oh. Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Newton. Now, can we have a vote on the temporary amendment to council procedure rules? All in favour, please show, please. I think that's pretty unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. I wish to remind members about the rules of debate as set out in rules 13.5 and 13.9 of the council procedure rules, which have not been suspended. These are set out in paragraphs 1, 2 and 3 below. Therefore, I have decided that the debate will take the form as set out in paragraphs A to G on page 5 to 8 on the order of proceedings. Councillor Hill, would you like to move the budget? Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman, fellow members, we do live in uncertain times. Around the world, there are fears of recession fueled by rising US interest rates, trade war threats, and China's ballooning debt and slowing growth. In the EU, there are similar worrying signs for reasons totally unrelated to Brexit. Across the Eurozone, growth in the last quarter was just 0.2%, with German car exports badly hit by falling diesel sales. In France, President Macron is being forced by violent street protests to back down on key reforms. Italy, sinking under huge public debt, is faring even worse and has now actually tipped into recession. With so many factors at play, the years ahead could be difficult for the global economy, and no one will be immune to the impact. Here in the UK, Brexit uncertainty has been a drag on growth as investors delay their spending plans. Despite that, and with the clock ticking towards the 29th of March, our prospects are better than the prophets of doom will admit. At almost 76%, employment remains at record levels, the best in Europe, and the number of young people without a job is down by half. We also have 300,000 more nurses and midwives, with nursing applications up by 4.5%. In the property market, low interest rates and slowing prices are helping first-time buyers, while 500 million is being invested in affordable homes. Average wage rises are also running ahead of inflation, meaning real incomes are on the way up, and the new 26 to 30 rail cards have already saved young people £3.4 million. With exports up by 14 billion, overall growth in the UK remains steady rather than spectacular, but the underlying health of the economy is good. That's due to sensible policies of Conservative governments since 2010 in reducing the deficit to sustainable levels and supporting growth. Of course, some can't wait to wreck all that with wild spending that would send the national debt soaring. We all know how that would end. Sky-high inflation, interest rates and unemployment. And for the many, not just the few. Back in the real world, Chancellor Philip Hammond announced in his last budget that the era of austerity is finally coming to an end. That doesn't mean the government can suddenly spend as though there's no tomorrow. It does, though, allow for a gradual easing of constraints, particularly to help the NHS. After 70 years, the health service is facing huge demand as we all live longer and expect more complex treatments. To pay for that, the government is increasing spending in real terms by over 3% every year until 2023. That's an extra 20 billion annually, funded in part by the vast sums we'll no longer be paying Brussels when we leave the EU. In addition to extra NHS support, we need real change to how adult social care is funded in the future. This is a vital issue, and the government is launching a green paper on it in the coming months. I'll now turn to Brexit, the subject that continues to dominate national debate. The 2016 referendum was the largest democratic exercise in British history, and both the main parties pledged the honour result in the 2017 election, and both were rewarded in the ballot box accordingly. That meant the freedom to take back control of our laws, borders and money, leaving the single market, the customs union and the European Court jurisdiction. At this stage, Parliament has failed to find a way forward that honours those pledges. For a clear majority of the British people, that's a betrayal, particularly by MPs putting partisan politics and dogma above the national interest. Today, the outcomes of negotiations remain unclear, and Britain could still leave without a deal. While that's not the preferred option, it would be much better than a bad deal. For businesses, the greatest threat isn't Brexit, but a general election at which there is the potential for a communist sympathising Prime Minister and unreconstructed Marxist Chancellor hell-bent on turning the UK into a Venezuela-style disaster. As Brexit unfolds in the tense weeks ahead, we must hold our nerve and insist on our right to become once again a truly independent trading nation. There must also be fair reciprocal arrangements for EU and British citizens who've made their lives here or on the continent. In Lincolnshire, councils have been allocated $400,000 to help with Brexit planning, and we've been progressing this for many months. We're also pressing the government to support local farmers and businesses in the years ahead, once subsidies are decided by Westminster rather than Brussels. As I've said, it's about taking back control, and politicians will answer to the electorate if they fail to do so. I mentioned that government has been committed since 2010 to cleaning up the financial mess it inherited. That has meant big reductions in spending on local government, with the LGA recently highlighting a $3 billion funding gap. The challenge is particularly acute for English county councils, including ours, which have lost out to urban areas far too long. We've consistently argued that Lincolnshire would be £116 million better off every single year if we received just the average funding for all councils. We've also made the case that services are much more expensive to deliver in rural and sparsely populated areas. Our high-profile campaign appears to be bearing fruit, and the government has given us extra money for rural services, road repairs and social care. That's to be welcomed, and the extra funding will help us meet the challenges we face over the next 12 months. However, it's one-off support, and we remain deeply concerned about the possible budget shortfall from April next year. In the longer term, the government has been consulting on a major overhaul of local government financing. The Fairer Funding Review will look at how much councils need to spend to deliver services in their area. It is also examining how much money we can raise locally and, in a separate consultation, how the business rate system could be improved. We expect to find out more in the autumn, with changes feeding into next year's budget, but early indications look favourable. In particular, Community Secretary James Brokenshire and Local Government Minister Rishi Sunak appear supportive of giving rural areas an equitable deal. Inevitably, we're seeing a reaction from authorities favoured by the current formula, and the government will need to stick to its guns to create a system genuinely fair for everyone. Besides fairer funding, the government is looking at social care financing through a green paper expected in the spring. At this stage, I'm cautiously optimistic that the government will deliver on these long overdue issues. Until it does, we have a responsibility to act according to what we know rather than what we hope for. In setting today's budget proposals, that has meant taking a measured approach to balancing the books. Of course, it's always more appealing to spend today and let someone else pick up the pieces for tomorrow. But that's not the Conservative way in Lincolnshire, and it never will be. Before I turn to our proposals, let's remind ourselves of the huge financial challenges we've met in recent years. We've adapted to a 90% drop in RSG, our main government grant, down from 211 million to just 20 million in 8 years. We've achieved £310 million of savings while still providing good frontline services. We've absorbed cost pressures of 276 million, including growing social care demands and wage increases. And we've done this without huge council tax rises as one of the lowest charging English shire counties. Despite committing over 100 million in reserves to balance the books, we've also kept enough for future years, although the total is now greatly reduced. Fellow members, it's a financial record we should be proud of, and one that has greatly enhanced the authority of this authority's reputation. That's particularly true at a time when other councils, including Northamptonshire, have shown the folly of delaying difficult choices. Of course, what matters above all is how we serve the 750,000 residents who rely on the services we provide. On that score, I'm convinced that we've delivered, given priority to safeguarding highways, flood risk and other areas of public safety. Over the coming year, that twin commitment to strong finances and good services must be maintained. What exactly do we plan to spend in the next financial year? And where will the money come from? Members will remember that we're in the final year of a 4-year deal with the government. It has given us some certainty in planning our finances, which is why we set a 2-year budget in 2018. As we updated this year's proposals, the final grant settlement delivered largely on what we expected. We'll receive 121 million of business rates, though unfortunately we won't be taking part in the pilot project again. Our RSG will be 20 million, with other grants providing 17.5 million. We also expect to raise almost 300 million from council tax, taking our total net income to nearly 458 million pounds. Late funding from government for rural services and social care, plus the national business rate levy and the council tax collection surplus, brought in a further 11.5 million pounds. Although hugely welcome, this is one-off funding and can't be relied on for future years. Neither can the £13.7 million announced by the DfT in November to help us repair our 5,500-mile road network, damaged by last year's extreme weather. The crucial point here is there's no substitute for a sustainable funding system for local government. That must take into account the cost of providing services across a large rural area like Lincolnshire. It must also reflect the extra resources needed to meet our social care commitments to an ageing population and the younger generation. In Lincolnshire and the other Shire counties, we now await the outcome of the government's reviews, and we do so with real concern for the future, not just passing interest. Fellow members, I've indicated that our total net income for the coming year will be £458 million. That matches our base budget requirement, but we've also had to absorb new cost pressures of £24 million, such as the national living wage. One way to do that, of course, is further savings. No easy task when we've already achieved 310 million of savings. Despite the difficulties, our proposals do identify savings of £16 million without cutting key services. Changes to our public health and better care fund allocations from government brought in a further £5.5 million. Even with that extra money, our proposals suggest drawing on £3 million of reserves to support the budget. That's thankfully much less than the 23 million we thought we'd need before the final settlement. Even so, reserves are obviously finite, and the latest figure comes on top of that committed over the past 8 years. Against that background, it would have been reckless to draw more heavily this year on our rainy day funds, and we won't. So what additional service have we protected through our careful approach? We've managed to reinstate 1 million for our heritage services while we consult on a new self-funding model across the whole county, which was partly described by Councillor Worth earlier. On the roads, we've allocated 820,000 to restore service levels for weed spraying, safety grass cutting and gully cleansing. Support for citizens' advice is also being reinstated in the base budget, helping those in need. As with any budget, it's a juggling act, and I thank everyone who took part in the consultation that underpinned it. On behalf of all of us, I'd also like to thank Pete Moore and David Forbes, ahead of their retirements, for their input into this and many previous budgets. Their expertise and advice has been absolutely invaluable, helping this council to keep its finances in the strong position we find them today. We owe them a real debt of gratitude, as do the people of Lincolnshire. Thank you. During this year's consultation, members, partners, stakeholders and the public were all generous with their time and views. And while it's never possible to please everyone, I believe we've come up with the proposals that will attract widespread support across the county. To keep the public abreast of the challenges we face, our communications team have been running a social media campaign called Testing Times. It looks at all kinds of issues around our budget and is well worth following on Twitter and other channels. Now let's turn to the council tax, the issue that mostly directly affects local residents. In 2019, as I've said, we'll be using 11.5 million of one-off funding and 3 million from reserves to balance the books. However, the challenge could be far greater than we meet again in 12 months. At this stage, we just don't know. For that reason, we need to act now to ensure our council tax base is strong enough to support the services next year and beyond. Our proposals, therefore, include a 4.95% overall increase in council tax, 1% more than originally planned, following late clarification from the government. The rise includes a 2.95 general rate plus 2% for adult care, in line with many other English councils. As the bills go out, an average Band D household will find itself paying an extra £61 a year, or £1.17 a week, for this authority. For the county's many Band A homes, the rise will be £41 over the year, or 78 pence per week. The increase will generate an extra £14 million annually for this council, enabling us to restrict our use of reserves to the £3 million I previously mentioned. Looking ahead to 2020, the extra 1% we're now charging, plus the increased number of new houses in the county, will together add £7.5 million to our base budget. That will offset some of the lost one-off funding, but even with the extra money, we could have a budget deficit of £30 million within 3 years. As realists, we must prepare for that scenario, and that means a council tax rise much higher than we'd like. Despite this increase, we expect to fully maintain our position as one of the lowest charging English Shire counties. It's also worth remembering too that our council tax has risen by just 15% over the past 8 years, compared with 25% inflation measured by RPI. And we're absolutely committed to having much smaller rises in future years, once new funding and social care arrangements are in place. It's what Lincolnshire residents expect of us, and we intend to deliver. I've spoken about the need to look beyond the immediate needs and scan the horizon. That now brings me to capital projects, our long-term investment in Lincolnshire's future. Over the next 12 months, we'll power £119 million into major projects, with £146 million planned for the following years. As always, the bulk will come from prudent borrowing, although outside funding could generate £110 million. Key schemes include the Lincoln Eastern Bypass and relief roads for Grantham and Spalding. For schools, we're investing £23 million to provide new places, and £4.5 million in buildings, and nearly £800,000 on special educational needs. We've also allocated £7 million for broadband, boosting prosperity across the county, and £2.6 million for flood risk. To keep firefighters and residents safe, we're putting nearly £10 million into new vehicles and equipment, as well as property improvements. That will ensure that Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue remains the best equipped service in the country, exactly as it should be. As I've said, we live in uncertain times. Does that mean I'm pessimistic about the future? Absolutely not. I often say that challenges bring opportunities, and bigger the challenge, the bigger the opportunity. That's definitely true of Brexit, which offers the UK the chance to redefine itself politically and economically for the 21st century. Closer to home, the government can energise local government, the bedrock of our communities, by establishing a funding system that's fair to all. It must also place social care on a sustainable footing, ensuring it can support the most vulnerable in the decades ahead. For this council, the challenge is to continue providing good services to all our residents, even as funding falls and demand rises. Over the past 8 years, we've shown again and again what we're capable of achieving. And with the right support from the government, we'll carry on doing so for many years to come on behalf of the people of Lincolnshire. This morning, it's our responsibility to set a common sense budget that meets the needs of both today and tomorrow. Fellow members, our proposals strike that right balance, that vital balance, and I commend them to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. That was very well delivered, if I may say so. Right, do we have a seconder for the motion, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to second the council budget, and I reserve my right to speak later in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Whittington. Now we have an amendment which to be moved by Councillor Rob Parker on behalf of the Labour Group. Councillor Parker, would you like to move your amendment?
Can I also, like Councillor Whittington, congratulate the Leader of the Council on the presentation of the budget? I think he would not expected me to say anything really valuable in support of it, but I do think that the measured tone to an extent and the broad coverage helps us better understand where the budget is coming from. Just want to make a couple of comments about the statement by Councillor Hill, but because I'm not quite sure who the speech was directed towards, because it seemed to be a clear indication to the 6 Conservative MPs in Lincolnshire, certainly to hold their position on Brexit, and I think that message got across very clearly, and it wouldn't surprise me if any of them were not to do what's expected. There may well be some repercussions. I think it was also a message to James Brokenshire about here we are with a budget for next year, a fairer funding review, work going on in relation to better care, and we expect something of you. So I think those 2 important messages are important, because the world that we're going to face in a year's time will be significantly affected by what happens in relation to Brexit and the financial consequences, and what happens to the local government settlement, and again the financial consequences. Now, I'm not sure about the optimism or pessimism rating of Councillor Hill at the moment, given the fact that page 1 of the speech, which I thank you for letting me have in advance, is seriously positive about a Conservative government and everything looks fine, lots of good things. But at the same time, there isn't that reassurance, that confidence that those things are going to turn into anything good for local government. And that's where I have some reservations about the doubt that you've got about the future, given you've got a Conservative government at the moment and the expectation of Brexit bringing in huge dividends, and yet there's no hope for the rest of the people about the way forward. It was a budget about money as opposed to services, and that's the position that I want to start from. If we look at, first of all, at the money available to the County Council in balances, and the reason I make this point is because it's probably not known by a lot of people just how much money we have in balances, because it is not brought together in one document at any particular point. I think it's fair to say that when we look at balances, we have to recognise that we've got £144 million in earmarked reserves in 101 different accounts, all for a rainy day, even if 82 of those accounts saw no activity in the current year. And it's a large piece of paper, and I can show it to you. This is the state of our reserve earmarked. We have got 101 accounts, of which 88 of them had no action in years. And it's an interesting read because it takes us back in time, it covers everything. A lot of them have got no activity. So that point is 144 million in earmarked reserves. The next point is that we have general reserves of £15 million, so we're now up to 190 million. We've got a financial volatility reserve of 46 million, so we're now up to 236 million. And Councillor Hill wants to create yet another account, a reserved account, earmarked account, for what's called the Business Rates Volatility Reserve of 5.9 million. Now, if you put all that together, that we've got substantial reserves, making it a total certainly of well over £200 million. And that's in relation to a revenue budget of 461 million. So we just think about that, it's just under a half we've got in reserves, balances, in your bank account. So if we take ordinary people, do you think ordinary people's income, they have savings of just under half of their regular income? Probably, I'll leave that to your judgment, but I can think of a lot of people that I know that don't have that level of balances in relation to revenue income. So our argument, and in a sense in the scale of the numbers that I've been talking about, is a very small amount of money. Our basic argument is there's no financial justification for the creation of yet another pot of money, a business reserve volatility reserve of 5.9 million. We're saying that some of that money should be released for spending on here and now pressures for the benefit that we're here to provide services for, because sometimes you get the impression when we hear speeches that there is little recognition that we're here actually to provide services. It's really about the money, how much money have we got for something that may happen in the future, and the future is being provided for at the expense of the here and now, and it's the here and now that I'm going to come to in a moment. What if we don't do this? Well, the arguments that we put forward and they remain the same, as I've said on this council chamber and other Labour councillors have said. Once we don't agree to extra spending on certain services this year, then people will suffer because they will not get anything this year. So if we say, well, tomorrow, then what about the people that don't get that service? And it's particularly important for children. And I want to start off with children's services. Some of the things that we've done as a council have been great successes. And it doesn't matter which government created Sure Start children's centres. Certainly this council have been, I think, leaders in maintaining children's centres and not closing them like other councils have done. We argue that they are such a success, but they're not open at the weekends, on Saturday particularly, so working families who may benefit from the services of children's centres don't get that opportunity. They may get it next year if you decide that that's going to be the return that you're going to put into when something looks good, Brexit dividend or James Brokenshire's new money. But we're saying that there's an opportunity here with that 5.9 million business reserve, volatility reserve, for some of that money to be used there. 48 children's centres. Now, a lot of people, councillors, have got a children's centre in their area. So what we are saying is that money, some of that money should go on that. Councillor Bradwell referred to projects that are going on in relation to Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. If we look at Key Stage 2, we know that young children in Lincoln are significantly below national expectations, and they're also below in performance that of other districts in the county in terms of attainment and progress. We want to see money spent on the 26 schools and academies in Lincoln to make a positive statement, just like a similar initiative that's already taking place at the moment and working well in Boston. So words coming back that the Boston initiative is a success, and we want to see it rolled out in Key Stage 2 in Lincoln. And if it doesn't get rolled out, that's it, gone. Okay, it may come next year, but children who could have benefited will not. And it's much the same in relation to Key Stage 4 pupils. That Lincoln, similar to the scheme that's already going in Boston, we think that children at Key Stage 4 pupils in Lincoln would benefit from a 2-year rollout in the secondary schools. If they don't get it, that's an opportunity gone. How many children will that be that could have been affected positively by an initiative taken by the County Council to narrowing the gap between educational attainment and typical lifestyle chances? Much the same way, small schools. We've got 82 schools with 100 or less pupils. Small schools, we know, are not always able to achieve what they want for their pupils because of geography and financial reasons. We think that a rollout of a 2-year project at a cost of 700,000 is good value for money and actually is contributing to that point that was made by Councillor Davey in relation to both himself and Councillor Bradwell, that we're doing all we can to enhance skills. Well, let's start with the small schools as well as those in urban areas. A point that is about that investing for today actually saves money for tomorrow and enhances people's lifestyles as well. Citizens Advice Bureau, we all know something, don't we, about universal credit, and we think that we should be funding a long-standing and highly respected organisation like the CAB to do important work to help benefit our citizens. We know that they give proper specialist advice, and we also know, that's one thing, we also know that everybody knows, really, Amber Rudd and Ian Duncan Smith, that the rollout of universal credit has not been one of the Conservative government's greatest success stories, and as such we should be doing something to mitigate the problems caused by that central government initiative. Okay, just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about capital schemes. Park and Ride, you know, Einstein once said that, you know, to expect the same outcome when essentially life hasn't changed is not a good thing and is a form of madness. But I've been here talking about Park and Ride for many years, and I know that people may think that Lincoln doesn't feel as though it's got a need for Park and Ride, but an investment would be a positive factor. Some of the issues that are being talked about today, the issue of pollution, the congestion, and although we put £10 million into the budget because that's what's the advice that's being given for the creation of one by treasurers, we can't help but feel that with the side-by-side work of developers, for example, a small supermarket, for example, a small hotel on a bigger site could actually reduce the cost of that significantly. We all look around, don't we? And Councillor Hill, for example, mentioned how well Lincolnshire was doing in comparison to Northamptonshire. And there's no doubt about it. But we look around at the same time and see Park and Ride wherever you go at typical cathedral cities like Lincoln. Councillor Clark will list them. But it's important. Don't we ever stop and think that we are the highway authority for the county, and here is the cathedral city, and here is a big tourist attraction, and why is it that other places do things differently to us? We want to reduce pollution. Two of the questions today were about pollution in Lincoln. Certainly Park and Ride would go some way towards dealing with that issue. If I just turn finally to the Usher Gallery, I mean, Councillor Worth, in answering a question, almost seemed surprised that the Usher Gallery, in relation to the heritage consultation, was the main issue. Well, I mean, what did you expect? I mean, I can't help but think that one of the issues that you might well have thought about is how you're squaring the idea of continuing to argue in the paper that the Usher Gallery will close as an art gallery, and then say, just today, that the art gallery will be used with some of the work being displayed. Well, there's a clear statement in there, which I've repeated time after time after time at public meetings, that the Usher Gallery will close as an art gallery. Now, are you saying that life's changed since that paper was written? I mean, it's an important point. I do think it's being neglected, a neglected treasure. I mean, one of the things that is noticeable is that when we come to one of the little or big revenue earmark reserves, here we have Heritage Services earmark reserve 880,000 going back to 2016. So there didn't have to be any neglect of the Usher Gallery, given you've stashed away £880,000 in order to do something about moving towards some entrepreneurial model when it could have been used. So anybody arguing that the Usher Gallery isn't as good as it could be are quite right. And where can we point the finger as to why that is the case as a neglected treasure? It's because the money's been stashed away in one of these earmark reserves. The point you were making, art will be retained there. Well, you'll need to make a bigger statement than that, I think, to interest people. So we put together a package of measures that, without exaggeration, is a limited amount of expenditure, you know, just over £3 million, hits all people in the sense of young children, people who are travelling, people who may be in need of help in order to get state benefits, and the wider public in Lincoln, for example, and the rest of the county who want to see the Usher Gallery maintained. So, we're putting this motion forward. If history is anything to go by, there will be attacks suggesting that the spending of £3 million out of a budget of 461 million with over 200 million in reserves is profligate, but we will wait the responses. If this budget doesn't, our amended budget doesn't go through, we certainly would like to see something done behind the scenes to think about those initiatives for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Have we a seconder for your amendment? Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to second the Labour amendment. Where to start? Obviously, park and ride. Park and ride, when you bring it up in the chamber, seems like Groundhog Day. I know since being elected in 2009, it's come up nearly every year. And I suppose before I was elected, Labour councillors were pressing for park and ride in Lincoln. I remember last year, when this arose, one councillor said, I'm voting against it because I'm here for Lincolnshire, not Lincoln. This is a mistake that people's making. They're thinking it is solely a benefit for the people of Lincoln. But in truth, and it is in truth, there'll be a high percentage of people actually living in Lincoln won't even use park and ride. The people who benefit are people, A, visitors, and B, people living in the catchment area of Lincoln, which covers a third of the county we represent. But why is Lincoln being left behind? Ask yourself, why has Norwich got 6 park and ride sites? York, similar to Lincoln, 6 sites. Salisbury, Chester, Exeter, Winchester all have 4 park and ride sites. Canterbury and Durham both have 3 sites. For someone looking in from the outside, this will seem like people aren't going to encourage people to come to Lincoln. They're doing the quite opposite. Moving on, something on children at school. Speaking as a father and a grandfather and also governor of a school, I want to tell you something about mine and your kids and your grandkids' future. Often we only get one chance at different stages in their lives. That's why we want to put money into children's centres now, this year, to extend the times they are open so that more families can benefit from the service on offer. Voting against our proposal and that chance is gone forever for some kids. Same with improving schools and kids' performance at primary and secondary level and in small schools that Councillor Parker referred to. The controlling group needs to address the issue without more children and young people not receiving the help they need. One item on capital spending. The last public Protection and Community Scrutiny Committee we attended, we was given rather a large document on the Heritage Service. Page 52 of the said document remarks on Heritage Service in Lincolnshire. It's yet to be fully appreciated by both domestic and inbound tourists, as the county has an undeveloped economy. Therefore, the amendment goes somewhat to address this. Hope you support the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Right, we shall now go into the debate. I now invite other councillors wishing to speak by indicating by raising their hand. So if you please raise your hand. I've already got a speaker, and I think it's Councillor Brewis. Councillor Brewis.
I didn't expect to be first, Chairman. Thank you very much. I thank Martin for his presentation and everything else. And it will not surprise people to know that I believe we've got to be responsible, and I shall not be supporting the amendment in its totality, although I have huge sympathy with the CAB item, because I think if we all had to employ the number of people that CAB give excellent advice to, it would cost us a fortune. I note as well that Martin and I, and a few others today, are wearing our badges about fairer funding. Now, I would say to all members, you may think that's a waste of time, but when I'm travelling about 1% of the people I happen to sit opposite in buses, trains or whatever, say, oh, what's your little badge about? And I tell them. And the more of us who wear it, the more it would have an effect. The little fairer funding for Lincolnshire one. I live in the Eastern Hemisphere, as I keep reminding you all, right next to Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, the only council division in the country with postal addresses in 3 counties and 2 regions. So I don't get many complaints about roads, because despite the problems in Lincolnshire, they're damn sight worse in Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. Our government, unfortunately, is obsessed with London, and particularly big cities. Please cancel HS2 tomorrow and give me 1/5 of the money, and I'll solve all the rail problems in the country. Let's move our capital to the centre of Britain, which, as many of you probably don't know, the centre of Britain on which we balanced on a pin is Haltwhistle in Northumberland. But anyway, perhaps Chesterfield would be better. They think, governments of all persuasions, that rural Britain will cope. And perhaps not in our best interest, we do. We cope and we trundle along. And we cope because they expect us to cope. It seems to me amazing, as somebody who studied history, that Elizabeth I, 2 years before the Armada, ran the entire country on £800,000. Maybe we need maybe we actually need a referendum on whether we go back to pounds, shillings and pence. The Arctic Circle moves north by 9 metres a year. The United States, because of the mid-Atlantic ridge, is 2.5 centimetres further away. To me, that's something that could be speeded up a little bit. Martin mentioned the NHS. There are 100,000 vacancies at the moment, I believe, in the NHS. To actually solve everything in the NHS would cost about 4p on the basic rate of income tax. But to properly fund public health and save the NHS billions would probably only cost 2p on income tax. And what happened to it? It was devolved to us, and then they took a lot of the funding away. Elderly people I speak to say that the moment is like the 1930s. It's a very dangerous moment in history. We've very few statespeople, and I'd like Martin to tell me when he thinks we'll actually get a decision on the fair funding review.
Thank you, Councillor Brewis. Well timed. My next speaker is Councillor Mrs. Bradwell. Councillor Mrs. Bradwell.
So quick, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Well, obviously, I just wanted to pick up on a few things that Councillor Parker has raised. Obviously, as Martin has said, we do need sustainable funding, and actually I think until we get sustainable funding, I prefer to have reserves. I mean, we've got a big project, but the Eastern Bypass, as we've said, you know, somebody unfortunately went bust, and I know the contractor's doing the work at the moment, but we don't know what we might have to find for huge projects like that. We've got schools projects as well, and we never know. We do need to have money back in reserves, I believe, to actually continue, so we can continue as a business. I mean, the County Council, I look at it as being a business. Well, we just said it's nearly £500 million of funding that we deal with, and we do need to have a backstop. I think once we get sustainable funding and know where we're going, that you know, then that's a different matter. But I do believe we're safe, and that's only because our council's safe because of the financial way we've moved since 2010, when we lost a lot of money. And so I believe this is the right way to go. And just picking up on children's centres, actually, 8 of our children's centres do open at the weekend. The ones, we've got one in Lincoln at Birchwood that opens, but most of them in the towns and the city are open. They are, yes, Birchwood's open. That one's alternative weeks, but lots of them are opening every week. And actually, it is about communities, you know, asking what they want, because sometimes, you know, we can have a children's centre open if nobody's really coming. But that's something we're doing. I'm really proud of our children's centres. We've got maternity hubs in a lot of them now, and we're looking to roll out another 6 across the county as well in phase 2. So there's lots happening there, and as you say, Councillor Parker, we are only a few councils have got them left like fully functioning like we have. But I mean, obviously, if parents wanted to do something like that, it is about, you know, working that through with the people who run the children's centres. But say in most of our towns there is one. Wainfleet is open as every other weekend as well, but we have one in Lincoln as well. Okay, so that's all I'd like to say, but I do support the budget, and I think we do need to be careful about how we would use our reserves if we decided to do that.
My mic went wrong. Thank you, Councillor Mrs Bradwell. My next speaker is Councillor Mrs Woolley. Councillor Mrs Woolley.
It's all right.
And I thought I had a big shouty voice. As you will recall, in October last year, the government actually set aside £51 million in total, specifically for CAB to actually help out with benefits as from this April. So there's been £12 million already in place putting into the CABs, and then Lincolnshire will be receiving a share of that £39 million. So I don't believe that this suggestion that you make is necessary at all.
I need to press it a few times, I can see. Right, my next speaker is Councillor Kate Cook.
Thank you, Chairman. I completely understand the need to be prudent in these uncertain times, and I appreciate that the proposed budget is based on this, but I do also agree with Councillor Parker's statement that some of our residents need help here and now. And talking about the CAB again, I'm of course really pleased to see that there's a budget proposal to support the core services of the CAB through the base budget as opposed to reserves as it has been being funded. And I do think that this is a step forward, of course, but I would like the benefit maximisation work that the CAB used to perform to be reinstated, as this is the work that helps the mentally ill, for example, with their benefit claims such as PIP. Now, there's a budget proposal to spend over £6 million on mental health, and we have spent £6 million as a council on mental health last year. I'm an LPFT governor, and I was completely shocked at the last LPFT governors meeting to hear from the divisional manager at LPFT that due to a reduction in funding for the benefit maximisation work the CAB used to perform, that people with mental health issues are now asking the community mental health team for benefit advice. The job centre in Grantham is in fact now having to train community mental health team staff in this area of work that used to be carried out by the CAB. A year ago, I was told by Councillor Hill and Councillor Woolley.
This isn't on, you know.
If I may continue, please. What I was going to say was that in the here and now, which is what the Labour leader is talking about, that people are not getting help. And when, can Councillor Woolley tell me when Lincolnshire will be receiving our share of this money and what that amount will be? because at this moment in time, people in Lincolnshire are really desperate to have this work reinstated. And what do you tell someone who's desperate for their PIP to go through, their universal credit to be sorted? Who is helping them now? Well, it's the community mental health teams being trained by the job centre, and that is not acceptable. I know it's not a statutory duty of this council to support the CAB, but we do have a statutory requirement to adult social care and mental health resources we are funding as a county council are being diverted away from the services they are supposed to be providing to our residents with mental health issues. So this is why I think it's essential that we reinstate funding we used to give to the CAB. I think £352,000, as proposed on the Labour amendment, is a relatively small amount of money for this council, considering it spends £6 million, for instance, on mental health.
Oh, it's working now. It did have a senior moment. Thank you for that. My next speaker is Councillor Robin Renshaw. Councillor Renshaw.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to refer quickly to a point about the Park and Take Us for a Ride scheme. Martin did refer to the council tax banding, and as we're all members of the LGA, I think it's a matter of imperative importance to this council that we get the bandings reviewed urgently, because it was highlighted in The Guardian recently about properties worth £200 million, which is 1,000 times the value of any posh house in Lincoln, is only paying the equivalent of 2 Band 8 properties. So, and there are a lot of properties in the capital like that. So there is available disposable income there, available, which we're not harnessing. And I'm sure people, I mean, don't go into too much detail, but one of the cases was a guy who lives somewhere else, and he's quite happy to pay the equivalent of a decent tax in where he's domiciled, but he doesn't have to pay it in the UK because of our lax council tax banding regime. But I'm sure that's something that we could take up with the LGA. On the extending children's centre provision, I've got a children's centre in my division, and it's well used and well liked. But because many of my constituents are on low incomes, they are forced to work weekends. And so there's definitely a need there for that service to be provided for them. On the, I mean, I can't disagree with the Social Mobility Task Force, because the where pupils need that improved school performance, it's definitely needed. And it's only in a few schools. And again, the small schools project, somebody did mention exactly how many small schools we've got. But I can see that under the funding formulas, they are going to struggle, and they need that small amount of money to help them. On the Citizens Advice Bureau, this affects the most vulnerable sections of the community. And as Councillor Cook said, the funding, it might be promised, but it's not getting through to the sharp end. And I know from friends in other towns in Lincolnshire that the problem that people have with the universal credit rollout, which is going to happen in Lincoln very soon, is the completion of the forms accurately. If they don't fill in the forms accurately, they get sanctioned, and they have to wait weeks on end for the money. And it's not money that they just want plugging from the air to go to the booze or anything like that. It's money they need to feed the children and to live on from day to day. So to ask for that little small increase in there is very small in terms of the budget that we have. And the alternative for them, of course, is if they don't get that money from the university credit when it as of their right, it's not something that they want to be on. It is to save them going into food banks and rely on charity and family friends. So there's some pride for people. You know, we want to encourage people to get back into work, give them some pride, not make them feel worthless. Thank you, Chairman.
You were preventing me, Councillor Renshaw. can't cut me off in my prime. Now my next speaker is Councillor Mrs Steely, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'd like to, really with what Councillor Cook and what Councillor Parker said, I'd like to re-emphasise my wish to see the funding for Citizens Advice Bureau looked at again. I recently had the pleasure to attend the opening of the community hub on Portland Street, which is in my division, and one of the main things that people wanted to talk to, and indeed a special session has now been given on a Monday morning, was about budgeting and concerns with filling in the universal credit slip and matters associated with that. So very much the issue about citizens' advice, and I think at the moment citizens' advice, I might be wrong, is only open 2 days a week. Residents in my area really do need help with lots of issues to do with money. Second thing that I'd like to emphasise is park and ride. I think park and ride is the hallmark of a modern city. So when my fellow councillor talked about many of the cities that had an extensive park and ride service, I think a tourist coming to Lincoln will not be particularly impressed by a very, very underdeveloped park and ride. And a couple of days ago, I was just doing some research on Lincoln's transport strategy, and I happened to look at the Lincoln City website, and they had what was called Vision 2020, and basically it was a very well marketed, well, when I say marketed document, it was a very easy to read document about what Lincoln City's vision was for the future. And the transport section said, and I will read it, it said, and this is asking people within Lincoln what they wanted Lincoln to look like in the future. It said, the transport infrastructure, particularly around the city, but across the city, needs to be improved. Areas where respondents wanted to see improvements included addressing traffic congestion, development of park and ride facilities, more cycle routes and better train links to the rest of the country. So as a council, if we keep getting stuck Groundhog Day by keep endlessly discussing a park and ride scheme, very much in its infancy, whereas when you go to other places, they're already there, we do not look like a modern city. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. My next speaker is Councillor Mrs Overton.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very pleased with some of the things that I see in this budget. I see quite a lot of the things that we've asked for from central government, that I was also part of the team lobbying to get that funding, and I'm pleased to see that it is coming into our council and is being put to good use. It is hard, I can see, for our Conservative-controlled members to make a budget fit when we are shortchanged by central government and in terms of rural versus urban areas. And what we have now received is a one-off. Is it at a time when we're in Brexit turmoil and the government knows very well that a number of their foot soldiers are about to go out for election this year? What we need, and was rightly said by the leader, is a long-term proper funding solution. And at the moment, it is hard to see the longer-term future beyond this year. The point on Brexit, I think the other thing that's worth making, the point worth making, is that this government blamed the EU for a number of things, whether it was about difficulty controlling immigration or whether it's funding, all kinds of things, and then called a referendum, and then called an election, where we now rely on a small section of DUP to help us make decisions for our country. So I don't think that you can blame this at the elector's door, at the voter's door. It's very much about the whole ethos that's been brought through from central government, and that's been our problem. Highways have got more, and I'm really pleased to see that it has come in. I would like to see it spent in the right places. I am concerned that with a huge increase in traffic in the rural areas, we're not seeing that reflected in the spend on the roads and the actual service of improvements of the roads as they are falling apart. So I think it's critical that we make sure that that funding does match the needs. We don't want to be accused by central government of doing the same thing as we accuse them of, and that is spending the money in the urban areas and not in rural areas. So we need to make sure that we do our bit. I would also like to see a lot more done for buses, cycle routes, and I know the cleaner streets, it's easy to say it's a district council, but actually we're talking about the whole character of Lincolnshire, and that's our business. So I can see some improvements, but there's a lot more to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Overton. Our next speaker, Councillor Mrs. Austin.
Wrong one. Thank you, Chairman. I'm not a professional public speaker, and you, as a council, will have to tolerate some of my rather incoherent comments. Yes, I think, as has been said, fair funding is the key, and we accept that we are at the mercy of central government for this. I'm sorry I'm not wearing my fairer funding badge. I usually wear the Alzheimer's one, and that perhaps brings me on to my next theme, insofar as mental health certainly has to be one of our priority areas. I realise we can't have a pick and mix budget, and I'm just going to pick out one or two items on both sides, but certainly from the alternative budget put forward by Councillor Parker, I do agree that we must put some more money to improving pupil performance, and I think this was perhaps even one of the things in my own question to Councillor Davey earlier today, as it is in both rural and in city and in town areas where we have these pockets of deprivation, and we must concentrate on all of those areas. But coming back to mental health and its effect it has on long-term unemployment, one of my declared interests, so I will declare it again now, is that I am a director, trustee, a long-term one, of Centrepoint Outreach in Boston, where we try and support the homeless and vulnerable of the area. And we see people who are increasingly now coming to us, as we operate a food bank, but equally to the other food bank in Boston, as they are in food banks across the country, but in particular across this county. And you ask why? Well, there are increasingly people on short-term contracts, 0 hours contracts, in and out of work, depending upon the availability. But so much also is this long-term unemployment because of mental health issues. So this must be one of our priorities. As regards, oh gosh, can I say one little bit more, please? 5 seconds, may I have 5 seconds? I can't support parking ride, I'm sorry, for Lincoln, how could I possibly face the people of Boston if I supported £11 million or £10 million going for that? And I do look forward to the day when that 11 million, which is still in reserve for economic development in Boston, because I'm fearing that with inflation, that 11 million is effectively getting smaller and smaller. So thank you for your indulgence.
I can get my mic on now. Can I just ask member, just keep your eye on the clock, please? It's to be fair to everybody. So that was just over 5 seconds, Mrs. Austin. Yeah. My next speaker, Councillor Key.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The budget, as it said, I do like most of the budget, but I do support the Labour amendment in the areas which have been highlighted. My concern on this budget, when I looked through it the other night on the computer, was the loans, the borrowing, and that's the one that actually concerns me the most. So I will be voting against the budget on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one way to keep me quiet, isn't it? Leave your mic on. Okay, my final one on the list at the moment is Councillor Cullen. Councillor Cullen.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with Councillor Cook and Councillor Parker on the CAB, and I've just heard the news that we are getting extra funding. I hope Mablethorpe gets an extra day. My biggest concern was we are an holiday resort. People do get laid off from October, November time. We had one case brought to me, one case that was seriously got 4 weeks holiday pay after working all the season in a holiday resort. That payment from Universal Credit was ordered back then because he got full payment right till end of January. When that came out, that was correct, we checked it out, and suddenly he gets a tax rebate for £45, and that's holding him back for another 2 weeks because that's classed as a payment. That's why we need money sending in the CAB. And I hope Mablethorpe gets an extra day because they're under pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I've just had another mini list given to me. Councillor Hilton Spratt. Councillor Spratt. Microphone. Microphone.
Is that all right? Can you? Thank you. Oh. I hope you'll give me a little leeway on that. We have nothing to fear from parliamentary self-government as far as Brexit's concerned. Britain gave the world parliamentary self-government. Just one or two comments, if I may. I want to concentrate on the national issue, but just to mention one or two comments. One or two councillors have mentioned here and now. Well, spend now, pay later. I seem to remember that the Labour were in control of this council between 1993, spent again, and in 1997, when the Conservatives lost massively nationally, in Lincolnshire, a Conservative council was returned. So what did the people of Lincolnshire actually think about Labour's local policies? They certainly didn't vote for them locally. Talking about the national issue, so here and now, the national issue. The Labour Party have said in their manifesto quite openly they want to borrow £100 billion a year over 5 years. They've said that quite openly. Well, that's spending for here. But didn't they do that when we were in government, borrowing 60 billion, 70, 80, 90, 100 billion a year? And what happened? It was one of the reasons that led to the crash, as well as the banking crisis, and we had no money left in the coffers to sustain the rest of the economy. And that's one of the reasons we were in the trouble we were in. Councillor Parker said last year, and I did agree with him actually, very rare I do agree with him, but he said, and I think it's a truism, as far as spending is concerned, we need to increase the size of the cake in terms of the national economy and the local economy. we need our cake increasing. And what I mean by that is more government funding, of course. But the interesting thing today is we've seen that government funding has gone down, but the Labour group still want to put up spending, despite the fact that the cake is still shrinking. But don't worry, Mr. Chairman, help is at hand. My very good friend, Councillor Parker, taught at Lincoln College for, I don't know, not too long, about 20 minutes. I taught there for a few years, and I taught law, as most of my friends and colleagues know. But when I first started teaching, I also did 4 years teaching basic economics. So help is at hand. I am more than happy to conduct a seminar for the Labour group on basic economic policy so they don't keep making the same mistake year on year on year of borrow, 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 spend, spend, spend. And the way they put it, nobody's going to have to pay for it. Nobody's going to have to pay for it. But we all know in the real world, it's the voters that will have to pay for it. So voters beware. If you borrow 100 billion a year, interest rates are going to go up. Banks will exert a price. And if interest rates go up, mortgage rates will go up. And voters beware what's going to happen if this tax and spend happens.
Thank you, Councillor Spratt. We're lucky to have you. Right. We've got to the end of the speakers, and I'd like to call on Councillor Whittington, who reserved the right to speak. Councillor Whittington, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. A very enlightening debate so far. I just want to pick something up on something that Councillor Parker said when he said that this budget seemed to be about money, not about services. Well, actually, it is about services. Because when the budget is being set, the budgets are set in consultation between the heads of finance of all the departments and the service managers. So they actually go along, speak to the service managers, identify what the cost pressures are in that particular area. They look at the demographic increases, they look in what known service developments there are. They also look at what savings and efficiencies they can make. So the budget is service driven. It's not money driven, it's service driven. It's what the services actually come back and actually tell the finance heads what they need to actually spend. That's the first point. To actually talk about quite a lot of the risk that we've actually got coming up over the next few years and why this is a prudent budget. We know that there's going to be a new spending review coming out at some point. We know that because of the commitments that have already been made centrally to the NHS, £20 billion extra, there's extra money been promised to both the Home Office and to the Ministry of Defence. The reality is that the share of the cake for local government is not going to increase in any real terms at all. So we await the outcome of the fairer funding review, which hopefully will spread that cake a little bit more fairly, certainly to rural areas like ourselves. The early indications are promising that our message is being listened to by central government, but there is still, as expected in all of these things, the urban areas, principally the Labour-controlled urban areas, are launching a bit of a fight back on this. So that is another financial risk, as is the fact we're going to a new spending review. We also know there's an adult social care green paper due at some point, which again, there's lots of financial risk associated with that as well. You look at in our budget, you'll see that we are currently dependent upon next year £46 million worth of funding from the Better Care Fund. At some point, that funding may at some point run out. We don't know what's going to happen to Better Care funding going forward. So again, there's a whole lot of financial risk still in the system. So on that basis, knowing the financial risk that we've got, this council has set a prudent budget. We have benefited by some one-off extra funding, which has been identified, which has closed the gap in the amount of money that we would need to take from reserves from £23 million down to £3 million. But let me reiterate the point, we are still having to take money from reserves next year, even with this one-off funding. Our financial volatility our financial volatility reserve will just be under £50 million. That is the reserves that we can actually immediately access. The whole notion that these earmarked reserves can come in to support revenue expenditure, which seems to be the point that Councillor Parker was making, is pure fantasy. Which then brings me on to a consideration of the Labour budget and why I actually think that it is dangerous. And it is dangerous to this extent because it's not just £3 million in 1 year. If you actually work out the impact of the Labour proposals over 5 years, over the next 5 years, which we know are going to be fraught with an awful lot of financial risk, the total expenditure there will just be shy of £14 million over 5 years. Set against even the financial volatility reserve level after Labour's proposals of £46 million, that will wipe out 30% of that over the next 5 years, at a time when we are facing some really, really massive financial risks in this county, where we don't know exactly what is going to be going on. I think Councillor Clark will actually agree with Councillor Clark on something. This is a little bit like Groundhog Day. And the reason why it's a little bit like Groundhog Day is that we get the same reheated mush every year from Labour around Park and Ride for Lincoln, around children's centres, around social mobility task force. None of this stuff has actually been through a proper, robust financial consideration. You know, when we are setting the budgets locally, you know, we actually go through a really, really robust process of working with the services to actually identify what you need. Some of this money, what are the outcomes of this going to be? How can they be measured? Where's your business case? Nothing on it. It's just a way of, oh, we've got a little bit of one-off money coming back in next year, so let's go and spend it. Let's go and splurge it all in one, you know, bit. It's a little bit like, Mr. Chairman, having a win on the horses and then going out that night and having a blooming good night out on it. We all know what happens in the morning, don't we? You wake up with an empty wallet and a nasty hangover. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
I'm more than willing to share the impact assessment that was passed to me by County Council officers, but given the fact that when we make budget speeches, we don't go into the huge detail, but happily after this meeting I'll share the impact assessment produced by officers of this council, and I'm sure that you'll accept that they were just as thorough as those given to the controlling administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point I am making is that in the budget proposals that we make, we list all of those out. There is nothing in your amended budget that actually refers to any of that. It just appears as a wish list, and it is always from you a total, unaffordable wish list designed purely for political purposes. And as always, yeah, extremely Lincoln-centric. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, I think we'll conclude that there. Right, members, thank you for that debate. I shall now ask Councillor Hill if you would like to respond. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to reciprocate to Councillor Parker and thank him for his comments about the presentation of the budget this morning, not just down to me, of course, as I've said, down to the finance department of this council, which has always been a very strong department, and long may it continue to be so. And also, I think, as always, Councillor Parker's amendment was quite clear, and obviously it does diminish. The ask diminishes every year, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint him again this year that we will not be supporting his alternative budget. I think, and the first part of what Councillor Whittington said is the main reason. We just don't know. And in my speech, I did talk about acting on knowledge and not hope. Yes, we are hopeful that things will come right for us next year, but we don't know that. They could go wrong for us. And remember, there's so many big issues there. The Green Paper on adult care funding has been delayed again. And the government, last Conservative government, put some proposals forward to fund adult care, and that obviously didn't go well, so there's a risk there. There's a massive risk to us with the Better Care Fund, which is, I believe, about £50 million just for this council. There's so many imponderables. So, yes, later in the year, and to answer Councillor Bruce's point, there is a consultation ongoing, which is fairly positive, it seems, for us. Some more details will come out in the spring as to how it might be shaping up. We won't really know until September, October, until the final weightings are delivered, and indeed each individual authority will have its allocation. So I think it's very important at this stage that we make sure that it is prudent, and it might be, if things come right, we can look on a more positive light of some of these proposals which have been put forward. When I don't again support the Lincoln Eastern Bypass, not just for the financial reasons, the park and ride. We are the Lincoln Eastern Bypass. I do support the Lincoln Bypass. I think I do anyway. I'm getting a bit, it's a bit, keeps having problems, Councillor Davis, I don't know. But I think whatever we do with the traffic in Lincoln, I think we've got to wait for Lincoln Eastern Bypass to be opened and running, and then we can look at how the traffic flows are and all the rest of it. I'll just try and raise some of the points that were made during the debate. Councillor Parker raised the issue about the Usher Gallery, and I sympathise with his point that clearly we are saying that the Usher Gallery will not become an art gallery. I think that's a reasonable point, because when you publicise something as an art gallery, you expect something which will be totally and mostly devoted, well, nearly totally devoted to displaying art. The art gallery will just move over the road to become mostly stored in the collection. That doesn't mean to say there won't be any art in the Usher Gallery. The plan is there clearly will be art in there, and there clearly will be some areas dedicated to art. Well, that's why we're up for consultation at the moment. And I think I would echo what Councillor Worth said. The council has been a massive success for the city and county. I have to say the current configuration of some of the offer, including the current collection and the Usher Gallery, are not a massive success. Attendance is very poor, and we really do need to upgrade the offer. When you consider what Hull has done, for example, with its offer of art and all the rest of it, and what we haven't done so far in Lincolnshire, I think the time for change is very much overdue, and I'm sure that the Usher Gallery, our plan is to make it not only more accessible to people, but actually open it up so people can have weddings and other issues there, which I'm sure will be a magnificent bonus for all those people in Lincoln. The CAB, I think Councillor Woolley explained very clearly that government is actually going to put this money in to reinstate, to look at how the people can maximise their benefits, because it's the amendment, if you look, is all about the maximisation of benefits. And obviously I remind members we've put the base budget for CAB back into the base. And of course, additionally, the government has made money available for rough sleeping to support people and help councils and agencies support those people and encourage those people not to continue to sleep on the streets and all the rest of it. Council tax banding, obviously that's LGA, I know, has been having some conversation with the banding, also the single person's discount. There's all sorts of issues that the government and the LGA is lobbying for. I think the big disappointment for me is that they are reviewing the business rate allocation. The government hasn't taken the opportunity to reform the whole way in which local government services are funded. And of course, we will become increasingly reliant on business rate income in the future as revenue support grant disappears altogether. And of course, as we know, that the way trading is done is moving away from building-based services, shops, for example, moving towards the internet. So I think everybody accepts the current business rate system is not really sustainable in the long term, and the government has actually not taken the opportunity to look at how it could be funded in a fairer and more sustainable manner in the future. Councillor Overton talked about the right areas. I'm afraid we all have the issue is there isn't more money going in, Councillor. We all have to accept as local member we have a strict asset management plan, and I think Councillor Davis has to patiently explain to people that although we would all like our own area to get special treatment, we have an asset management plan which is there for a purpose, which enables us to get more money from the government because we are doing it in a precise and consistent way. But also, you know, we've just got to accept that and try and mend the roads and try and get into a preventive way. But that doesn't mean, of course, as Councillor Davies said, that dangerous potholes will be and should be repaired as soon as possible, no matter where they are. I would also say that the LGA, you know, could do more, I think, you know, and obviously we've got to make a decision fairly shortly whether we continue our membership of the LGA. From our perspective, the LGA has yet again not covered itself in Gorey. As part of the government consultation, it supported a move by those authorities which were going to lose out to actually put deprivation back in the formula, which, on the face of it, could disadvantage rural areas. I think in the spirit of cooperation that the Rural Council, CCN, didn't object to that, but I do hope that Councillor Overton, in those discussions within the LGA, make sure they do actually stand up for rural areas properly, because frankly, they're not doing it as well as they could at the moment. And all we're asking for is fairness. We're not asking for special treatment. We actually spend £6 million on mental health in this council, supporting it directly. So I wouldn't want members to feel that we are neglecting that. Councillor Key raised the issue of borrowing, and I think that's a valid point. We do borrow money, but if we didn't borrow money, there'd be no Lincoln Eastern bypass, there'd be no all sorts of things, because unfortunately, these days, like every other council, we have to rely on borrowing to provide that future funding, and there'll be stuff in Gainsborough, I'm sure, which would never have happened if we hadn't able to borrow. We do have a prudent limit for borrowing, that is no more than 10% of our revenue budget. I think we're currently running at about 5%, so it is monitored, and we have a limit to make sure when we borrow in the future, we're not spending more on repaying the borrowing than we can afford, and that will continue to be so. And of course, as borrowing drops out, whether it's 25 years or 40 years, this year, for example, we've paid back several million of borrowing. I can't remember the figure. So it is we try and have a prudent approach. It would be nice not to borrow, but I'm afraid that is not possible in the current climate. The main point I want to come back to, obviously, Councillor Parker did make the issue about reserves, and I think that's a fair point. He did quote quite a large figure, but I think what I would also say in return is there are various issues we have to hold reserves for which are not available. For example, schools, we hold the schools' reserves on their behalf, and I think that's something like 30 million. I can't remember the figure off the top of my hand.
Sorry to interrupt you, Martin.
Yeah.
But that figure that I quoted didn't include school reserves.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay, thank you. But there is other things like winter maintenance, insurance reserves, and obviously we did review the allocated reserves some years ago, but I think as part of our work this year, we'll have another look at them again to see whether we need them all. There are a whole load of reserves we hold for that, and as Councillor Whittington said, the actual volatility reserve is about 60 million. And let's say we end up with a 30 million annual shortfall because it all goes wrong. Well, that won't last very long. So it comes back to, I'm afraid, we do need to, at this particular time, just wait and see for a few more months to see where we stand, and then we can look at all sorts of other things which potentially we could be more ambitious in the future and put more into services, which would be a good thing. And I think the other thing you need to remember is that when business rates localisation happens, when 75% of business rates come to a local area, we are being strongly advised, all councils, we need more reserves because there is a risk if a major employer, and I don't want to mention any names, I don't want to tempt Providence, if they go down, at the moment the government covers that because it's done nationally. If it's done locally, that will be a massive risk to both for this council, because that will leave a big hole in your budget which you will have to fill that year, and you do need the reserves carrying on. So I would commend, I'm sorry we don't feel able to support the amended budget this morning, and I would commend it too. I think the one thing I would think Councillor Parker was a little bit unfair. Of course, we do support services, but to support services you need to provide the finance. But with that, I do hope members we feel able to support this budget I presented this morning.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hale. Right, we now have to move on to a recorded vote, and we will vote firstly on the Labour amended budget. So I'll ask Debbie will read out names in turn in alphabetical order, and if you're for the amendment you say for, and if you're against it please say against. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you very much. And if you wish to abstain, if you could just say that you wish to abstain. Thank you. Councillor Adams. Against. Councillor Aaron. Councillor Ashton. Councillor Austin. Councillor Bowles. Councillor Bowkett. Councillor Mrs Bradwell. Councillor Brailsford. Councillor Brewis. Councillor Bridges. Councillor Brooks. Councillor Boutroyd. Councillor Corey. Councillor Clark. Councillor Cook. Councillor Cooper. Councillor Coupland. Councillor Cullen. Councillor Davey. Councillor Davies. Councillor Dobson. Councillor Fido. Councillor Fleetwood. Councillor Griggs. Councillor Grocock. Councillor Higgs. Councillor Hill. Councillor Key. Councillor Killy. Councillor Kirk. Councillor Lawton. Councillor Macy. Councillor Marfleet. Councillor Matthews. Councillor Morn. Councillor McNally. Councillor Mrs Newton. Councillor Mrs Overton. Councillor Oxby. Councillor Parker. Councillor Pepper. Councillor Perrotton Williams. Councillor Rawlings. Councillor Christopher Reid. Councillor Robert Reid. Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Skinner. Councillor Mrs Sneath. Councillor Spencer. Councillor Spratt. Councillor Stokes. Councillor Storer. Councillor Strange. Councillor Strengle. Councillor Thompson. Councillor Trollope-Bellew. Councillor Whittington. Councillor Woolley. Councillor Linda Wotton. Councillor Ray Wotton. Councillor Worth. Councillor Young.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that's clearly lost. We shall add up the figures. Have we got the figures? We have the figures to hand. Thank you. Right. For the Labour amendment, the votes for the amendment are 8, against the amendment of 54, and no abstentions. So now we come to the original budget, and again we'll have a recorded vote. Debbie will call out your names again in turn. So if you're for the original budget, say for. If you're against it, say against. And if you wish to abstain, which I missed out before, say abstain. Over to you again, Debbie.
Thank you very much. Councillor Adams. Councillor Aaron. Councillor Ashton. Councillor Austin. Councillor Bowles. Councillor Bowkett. Councillor Bradwell. Councillor Brailsford. Councillor Brewis. Councillor Bridges. Councillor Brooks. Councillor Boutroyd. Councillor Corey. Councillor Clark. Councillor Mrs Cook. Councillor Mrs Cooper. Councillor Coupland. Councillor Cullen. Councillor Davey. Councillor Davies. Councillor Dobson. Councillor Fido. Councillor Fleetwood. Councillor Griggs. Councillor Grocock. Councillor Higgs. Councillor Hill. Councillor Key. Councillor Killy. Councillor Kirk. Councillor Mrs Lawton. Councillor Macy. Councillor Marfleet. Councillor Matthews. Councillor Morn. Councillor McNally. Councillor Mrs Newton. Councillor Mrs Overton. Councillor Oxby. Councillor Parker. Councillor Pepper. Councillor Perrotton Williams. Councillor Rawlings. Councillor Christopher Reid. Councillor Robert Reid. Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Skinner. Councillor Mrs Sneath. Councillor Spencer. Councillor Spratt. Councillor Stokes. Councillor Storer. Councillor Strange. Councillor Strengle. Councillor Thompson. Councillor Trollope-Bellew, Councillor Whittington, Councillor Woolley, Councillor Linda Wotton, Councillor Ray Wotton, Councillor Worth, Councillor Young.
Thank you, Debbie. So we've had a new computer installed, so we've got the results pretty quickly now. Modern technology, you cannot beat it. Those for the budget, 54. Those against, 8. So this budget is clearly passed. Thank you very much, members, for a very involved and good debate on that subject. We move swiftly on to Council Business Plan. Item number 7 on the agenda, and I call on Councillor Martin Hill to move.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, logically following straight on from the budget, we do now to agree the business plan for this council for the following financial year. It is there presented to you. It has already been through a consultation period. Overview and Scrutiny Committee considered it and made, although broadly supported, made some amendments which were accepted by the executive. So collectively, we are now presenting it to this council for approval for the ensuing year.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. Have we a seconder, please?
Yes, I have pleasure in seconding that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Mrs. Bradwell, do we have any speakers? Obviously, it's been to scrutiny. If I can just ask Councillor Mrs. Bradwell to switch your mic off. Thank you. It's all right. So we need a vote in that. So all in favour of the Council's Business Plan 2019-2020, please show. Oh, sorry. Yeah, just before that, we've got Councillor Parker. We didn't see his hand rise. Councillor Parker.
I didn't put it up. I just thought,
oh.
Anyway, let's go into this. Right, not wanting to disturb the equilibrium about this report, I'd just take a small point back to Councillor Hill, is the logical approach would be to set your business plan first and then allocate the resources to it afterwards. But, you know, we don't want to get in the way of the big speech, honestly. We did consider this at Overview and Scrutiny Management Board. There were 4 areas that we had a discussion about relating to antisocial behaviour, adults with a direct payment, mental health issues and recycling. Recycling of household waste is a big issue. Anyway, as Councillor Hill said, we debated, discussed, passed our stuff on, and the business plan was amended to meet our concerns. So I'm happy to support this resolution.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. No further speakers. Right, we'll rewind and ask those in favour, please, to show by raising your hands. Thank you. Any against? Any abstentions? 1 abstention, but that is clearly passed. Thank you very much indeed. Swiftly on to item number 8, the Pay Policy Statement and Gender Pay Gap Analyst, and Councillor Barry Young to move. Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chairman. I move that the Council approves the Pay Policy Statement at Appendix A to the report and notes the gender pay gap analysis attached at Appendix B to the report. This is in accordance with the recommendation of the Pay Policy Subcommittee.
Thank you, Councillor Young. And do we have a seconder, please?
Yes, I'd like to second that.
Thank you, Councillor Boothroyd. Are there any speakers on this before we take the vote? No? Okay, so all in favour, please show. Thank you very much. Any against? Any abstentions? That is clearly moved. Swiftly on to item number 9, the Members' Allowance Scheme for 2019-2020. Again, I'll call on Councillor Hill to move this. Councillor Hill.
Yes, thank you. Annual report to the Council about members' allowances, and members will recall that the Independent Remuneration Panel made recommendations at the start of this Council that members' allowances should be matched to the increase in salary, to the average increase in salary to staff who work for the County Council. So that I'm proposing is that is what we do today and follow the recommendations we were given.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. Have we a seconder for that? Thank you, Mrs. Newton. That's fine. Have we any speakers on this at all? No? Well, we can go straight on to the vote. All in favour, please show. Lovely. Any against? And any abstentions? Just one abstention. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, members. That concludes a very good meeting. Praise you for all being on your best behaviour. And I'd like to remind members to collect their pigeon post, their post from your pigeonholes after this meeting. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much, members.